He picked up his wife's black card in front of 40 guests, held it to the light like evidence, and told the waiter to run it again. Slower this time. Loud enough for the room to hear. He wanted an audience for her shame, and he got one. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman standing there in a modest navy dress, waiting quietly while strangers stared, was the reason that card, that restaurant's lease, and the bank sitting 11 blocks away with her name buried 3 layers deep in its ownership structure, all existed in the first place. She wasn't going to tell him. Not yet. She wanted to see exactly how far he would go first. And by the end of that night, he had gone further than she ever imagined a man who once cried in her arms over unpaid rent ever could. This is the story of Adaline Reyes, and the $95 billion secret she carried into a room full of people who thought they were watching her fall. You would not have picked her out of a crowd. That was always the strange thing about Adaline. She had a way of making herself smaller than the space she occupied, folding her hands, lowering her voice, letting other people finish her sentences. People mistook that for emptiness. It was never emptiness. It was restraint, and restraint, when it finally runs out, does not look like anger. It looks like calm. And calm, the narrator promises you, is the most dangerous thing in the world when it belongs to someone who has been underestimated for 20 years. The restaurant was called Verano, a glass-walled place downtown with a view of the harbor and a wine list nobody without money bothered to open. Adaline had reserved the private room herself 3 weeks earlier. She had chosen the flowers herself, white ranunculus, because her husband once mentioned, years ago, in a version of himself that barely existed anymore, that white flowers reminded him of his mother's porch. She had picked the seating chart with care, putting his favorite cousin across from him, his business partner 2 seats down, his mother at the head so she'd feel important. Every detail of that night belonged to Adaline's hands. Every detail was for him. Because that night was supposed to celebrate her husband, Julian Reyes, and the partnership he had just been made at Callister & Vane, the investment firm where he'd spent 9 years climbing, clawing, performing. Adaline had watched every year of that climb from the seat beside him. The one nobody photographed, the one nobody thanked. When he lost his first big client, she stayed up until 3 a.m. helping him rebuild the pitch deck. When his father died and the firm gave him 4 days to grieve, she was the one who sat with him on the bathroom floor at 2 a.m. so he wouldn't be alone with it. 12 years of marriage, and not once had she asked to be seen for any of it. She simply kept showing up. So she filled that private room with the people Julian loved, and she sat quietly at the far end of the table, and she watched him take the seat at the head like it had always belonged to him. Watch how they treated her before anything went wrong. That's where the Reyes story begins. His mother, Corinne, arrived 20 minutes late in a fur-trimmed coat that cost more than most people's rent, and the first thing she said to Adaline was, "Still wearing department store, I see." She said it lightly, like a joke, the way people say cruel things when they want deniability. The table laughed the polite kind of laugh that lets cruelty pass as charm. Adaline smiled and refilled Corinne's water glass. Julian's business partner, a sharp-jawed man named Preston, leaned across the table halfway through the appetizers and asked Julian, only half joking, whether he was going to upgrade the whole picture now that you're a partner, or just the suits. Julian laughed. Adaline felt that laugh land somewhere just beneath her ribs, but she said nothing. She had learned, over 12 years, exactly how much weight a woman is allowed to carry silently before people start calling it dignity instead of doormat behavior. She had decided long ago which one she'd rather be. And then the door opened, and a woman walked in wearing red, and everything shifted. Her name was Simone. She worked in business development at the firm, and she had, according to Julian, just happened to be in the area. Nobody had told Adaline she was coming. Simone walked straight to the empty chair beside Julian, the chair that had been left open for his best friend, who was running late, and sat down like she'd always belonged there. Her hand found his forearm within the first 90 seconds. His whole posture changed the moment she touched him. Adaline noticed it because Adaline noticed everything. That had always been her gift and, on nights like this, her curse. "Everyone, this is Simone," Julian said, beaming. "She's been a huge part of the deal that got me the partnership." Nobody clarified what kind of part. Adaline didn't ask. The dinner rolled forward the way a wave rolls toward shore, slow, then sudden. Simone asked Adaline, sweetly, cruelly, what she did all day, and when Adaline said she managed the household and did some independent consulting work, Simone tilted her head like she was looking at something slightly sad and said, "That's nice. It's good someone gets to slow down." Corinne laughed into her wine glass. Preston smirked at his plate. Julian didn't correct anyone. He didn't even look at his wife. Here's what none of them saw, because none of them ever looked closely enough to see it. Adeline's hand rested the entire night on a small leather-bound ledger tucked inside her handbag, cracked at the spine. The ink on its first pages faded to the color of weak tea. She wasn't holding it for comfort. She was holding it the way some people hold rosary beads, out of habit built over decades, a physical anchor to a version of herself nobody at that table had ever bothered to meet. Then the check came, and the real performance began. Julian raised his hand before the waiter could set the leather folder down in front of him. "Let my wife handle it," he said, loud enough for two nearby tables to hear. "She loves managing our little budget." The room chuckled. Adaline reached into her bag without a flicker of hesitation and placed her card on the tray, because that was simply true. She had always handled the household accounts, cheerfully, without complaint, for 12 years. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known sitting there in that navy dress with her spine straight and her face composed, was that 4 hours earlier, from his office on the 31st floor, Julian had made a phone call. He had frozen the joint account tied to that specific card. On purpose. He had done it that afternoon, while Simone sat across from his desk laughing at something he'd said, because he had decided, quietly, cruelly, in a version of himself Adaline had never met before that year, that tonight was the night he would show the whole table exactly how small his wife really was. The waiter returned 5 minutes later with an apologetic whisper. Julian didn't let him whisper for long. "Declined." Julian said, loud, theatrical, eyebrows arching in mock surprise. "Adaline. Baby. Did we forget to pay the light bill again?" The piano in the corner kept playing. Nobody else in the room did. Corinne gasped with theatrical delight. One hand pressed to her chest like she was watching the finale of a show she'd been waiting all season for. Preston pulled out his phone, not to help, to film. Simone pressed her napkin to her mouth to hide a smile her eyes made no effort to hide. And Julian, glowing with a kind of cruelty that had clearly been rehearsed, spread his hands toward the table like a magician revealing a trick. "Go on," he said. "Ask the table nicely. Maybe somebody takes pity." 2 tables over, a fork stopped halfway to someone's mouth. A sommelier froze near the wall, unsure whether to intervene. 40 strangers turned their attention to the quiet woman in navy, waiting, the way rooms full of people always wait when they sense a public unraveling about to happen, to watch her come apart. She did not come apart. She set down her fork. She folded her napkin into a neat, unhurried square, the way you fold something you intend to keep. And she smiled, not a broken smile, not the brittle kind people expect from someone who has just been gutted in front of a room of strangers, but something quieter and infinitely more unsettling. A smile that knew something the room didn't. The restaurant's general manager arrived at the table within 90 seconds, which should have told Julian something if he'd been paying attention to anyone besides himself. The man didn't come to apologize for the card. He came to Adeline's side, bent low, and said 4 words that would have changed the entire tenor of that dinner if anyone else had heard them. "Ms. Reyes. Is everything all right?" Not Not the generic apology reserved for a declined card. "Ms. Reyes, the way you address someone whose name is already written somewhere important, somewhere the staff had clearly been briefed on before she ever walked through the door." Adaline simply nodded, thanked him, and told him everything was fine. He backed away with the particular carefulness of a man who has just realized he almost let something very expensive go very wrong. Julian didn't notice. He was too busy laughing with Simone. But you should notice. Because to understand how a woman ends up sitting silently through her own public humiliation while owning the very foundation the room is built on, you have to go back. Years back. To a hardware store in a town so small the highway signs didn't bother naming it, and to a man with ink-stained fingers who taught a girl the one lesson that would end up outlasting everyone at that table. Long before Verano, before the glass towers, before she'd ever heard the words controlling interest, Adaline was a girl named Addie who spent her summers behind the counter of Reyes Hardware. No relation to the man she'd one day marry, a strange coincidence she'd never fully gotten used to. Her grandfather, Tobias, ran that store for 31 years on a corner that most of the town had quietly given up on. He kept a ledger. Not a computer, not a register with a screen, an actual paper ledger, cracked leather, the same one that would one day sit inside Adeline's handbag at a restaurant called Verano. Tobias wrote every transaction in that book by hand. Every nail sold on credit to a family that couldn't pay that week. Every dollar of debt he quietly forgave when winter got hard. And he never, not once, not even the year the store nearly closed, wrote down a number he couldn't stand behind. She remembered one particular afternoon, the store nearly empty, money so tight her grandmother had been rationing coffee. A contractor came in to buy lumber in bulk, distracted, phone pressed to his ear, not paying close attention to the count. 12-year-old Addie, doing the math in her head, realized she could round the board count up by a few and he'd never notice, a little extra to help cover that week's shortfall. She was reaching for the tally sheet when her grandfather's hand covered hers, gently, and moved it away. He recounted the lumber. Charged the honest number. After the contractor left, Tobias sat her down on the stool behind the register and opened that ledger to a blank page. Addie, he said, money has a memory. It remembers exactly how you treated people back when you had none of it to spare. You cheat a man for $12 today, that debt doesn't disappear, it just moves. It waits. And one day, when you've got more than $12 to lose, it comes looking for the difference. He closed the ledger and pressed it into her hands. You don't chase money, girl. You keep your name clean, and eventually money comes looking for you instead. He taught her other things too, in the years after that. Things that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with how to hold herself in a world that would eventually try to convince her she was worth less than she was. Loud money is scared money, he used to tell her, rocking on that porch after closing. Anybody with a full pocket can make noise with it. It takes a different kind of person to build something and never once feel the need to announce it. He told her that people reveal exactly who they are the moment they believe you have nothing left to offer them, and that she should always believe them the first time, because people rarely lie about their own cruelty twice in a row, they simply repeat it over and over, until someone finally stops excusing it. He gave her that ledger the week before he died, 3 years later. No inheritance, no property, nothing with a dollar figure attached to it. Just a hardware store that got sold off to cover his debts, and a book full of decades of honest arithmetic. Adaline kept it anyway. Through community college. Through the studio apartment she shared with 2 roommates while temping at a title insurance company. Through the year she met a broke, brilliant, hungry young analyst named Julian Reyes, who had holes in the soles of his shoes and a spreadsheet full of ideas nobody at his firm would fund. She saw something in him nobody else bothered to look for. She believed in him before the world gave her a single reason to. And quietly, patiently, the same way her grandfather had built a name nobody could accuse of cheating them, Adaline built something of her own, something Julian never once asked about, because Julian, like most people at that table, had decided a long time ago that a quiet woman with a modest handbag had nothing worth asking about. What none of them knew was that 11 years earlier, using a maiden name buried under 2 corporate layers, Adaline had made a single, terrifying bet on a failing regional bank that everyone in finance had already written off. She hadn't inherited the capital. She'd built it slowly first, flipping small properties, then a stake in a shipping logistics firm, then a controlling position in a distressed lender nobody wanted, purchased for a fraction of what it was worth because she was the only person patient enough to see what it could become in a decade instead of a quarter. She never gave interviews. She never put her name on a building. She let the executives she installed take every public bow while she sat, unbothered, in rooms nobody photographed. Slow money, her grandfather used to say. Slow money is strong money. Loud money burns fast and dies broke. By the night of that dinner at Verano, the failing regional bank Adaline had quietly rebuilt from the inside had a new name, Holstead Meridian, and a balance sheet worth $95 billion. It financed half the commercial real estate in the city, including, though he had genuinely never once asked how his own firm's biggest deals got funded, every major transaction Julian's partnership had been built on. Now you understand why the manager at Verano bowed his head instead of apologizing for a declined card. Now hold that, because we're going back to the present, and it gets worse before it gets better. The days after that dinner did not get gentler. They got sharper. Julian came home that night lit up with something Adaline hadn't seen in him in years. Not love, not shame, but a kind of intoxicated cruelty, the specific high certain people get from feeling powerful at someone else's expense. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look at her directly. Simone had spent the last several weeks, Adaline would later learn, whispering into his ear that a man on the edge of a partnership needed a wife who could match his trajectory, not a woman who played house while he built something real. And Julian, hungry for a version of himself he liked better than the one he actually was, had swallowed every word of it. Corinne fed the fire from her end of the family group chat, a place Adaline had been quietly muted from months earlier without anyone bothering to tell her. "You've outgrown her," Corinne told Julian over the phone, loud enough that Adaline heard it through the guest bedroom wall she'd started sleeping behind. "She was fine when you were nobody, sweetheart. You're somebody now. Somebody needs a woman who photographs well at galas." Adaline pressed her palm flat against that wall and let it wash over her, the same way she had let so many small cruelties wash over her for 12 quiet years. She did not cry out. She did not argue. She simply breathed, and waited, and let the ledger in her handbag be the only witness to how much that particular sentence cost her. Then the video surfaced. Preston had recorded the entire humiliation at Verano, the declined card, Julian's mock surprise, Adaline's silence, and posted it to a private group chat with a caption that read, "Finally put her in her place." It spread through the extended family in hours, laughing emoji after laughing emoji stacking beneath a video of a woman being publicly gutted by her own husband. Adaline watched it exactly once. Watched herself sit still while a room full of people she'd fed, celebrated, and stayed up nights supporting laughed at her smallness. Then she set the phone face down on the counter and did not pick it up again for 3 days. Simone grew bolder with every week that passed. She started appearing at the house Adaline had spent a decade turning into a home, walking through the rooms with the casual entitlement of someone auditioning to replace the furniture. "It's not personal," she told Adaline one afternoon, running a manicured finger along a bookshelf Adaline had built herself the first year they were married. "Some women are built for spreadsheets. Some are built for staying home. You should be relieved, honestly. Less pressure." And then Corinne began packing. She arrived one Tuesday with cardboard boxes and a look of pure satisfaction, folding Adaline's clothes out of the closet they'd shared for 12 years. "We're just making room," she said, smiling the particular smile of a woman who has waited a long time to win. "Julian needs space to grow into who he's becoming." The narrator will be honest with you here, because a story that only shows the strength and never the cost isn't telling the truth. There were nights Adaline nearly ended it all with a single sentence, nearly said, "Julian, do you have any idea what happens to your entire career the moment I make one phone call?" The word sat right behind her teeth more than once, sharp and ready. She held them back every time. Not from fear. From something colder and more deliberate. She needed to know, once and for all, whether the man she had built a life around would still choose her when he believed she had nothing left to offer him, or whether he would discard her the moment her usefulness appeared to run out. A love that only survives when you're valuable was never loved to begin with. And Adaline needed the truth more than she needed comfort. So she let him show her exactly who he was. And he did. 3 weeks after the dinner at Verano, Julian sat her down at the kitchen table, the same table where she had once talked him through the worst night of his career at 2 in the morning, and slid a folder across it without meeting her eyes. "I want a divorce," he said, flat, rehearsed. "And let's be clear about something, Adaline. You came into this marriage with nothing. You'll leave it with nothing. Don't make this messier than it has to be." He stood, gathered his jacket, and was already dialing Simone's number before the front door clicked shut behind him. Adaline sat alone in the dark kitchen for a long time after that. She did not turn on the lights. She let the cold settle into her chest the way it does when 12 years of devotion gets reduced, in a single sentence, to nothing. Her hands trembled as she reached into her bag and pulled out her grandfather's ledger, running her thumb along its cracked spine the way she had 1,000 times before, in 1,000 harder years than this one. She thought, sitting there in the dark, about the year she'd met him, 24 years old, temping downtown, sharing a walk-up apartment with 2 roommates because the bed frame had never made it past the moving truck. Julian had been 26 then, brilliant and broke and terrified, sketching investment models on the backs of diner receipts because he couldn't afford the software everyone else at his firm used. She remembered the night he cried in her lap after his first big pitch got laughed out of a boardroom, certain his career was already over before it had begun. She held him that night and told him the plainest truth she knew, that the people laughing at him had never once had to build something out of nothing, and that he would outlast every one of them if he simply kept his name clean and kept showing up. She believed that for him before he ever believed it for himself. She had never once asked him to remember it. She had simply assumed, foolishly, that a man doesn't forget who held him together on a bathroom floor he couldn't afford new tile for. 12 years later, that same man had just told her she'd leave their marriage with nothing, in a tone that sounded rehearsed, like he'd practiced it in the car on the drive home. And then her phone rang. A single call, from a number almost nobody on earth had. She lifted it to her ear, listened, closed her eyes, and the trembling in her hands went still, completely, unnervingly still, because what she was hearing on the other end of that call was the confirmation of something she'd been quietly building toward for months, ever since the whispers about Simone first started, ever since she'd first suspected exactly how far Julian was willing to go. "Set the meeting," Adaline said, her voice low and level. "Friday. The executive boardroom. Make sure every single one of them is in the room." They told Julian it was a settlement meeting, that his soon-to-be ex-wife wanted to formalize the terms of the divorce at her attorney's offices, and that he was welcome to bring whoever he liked. Julian, thrilled at what he assumed was surrender, brought an audience on purpose. He wanted witnesses to his victory. He brought Simone on his arm, dressed like she was attending a celebration. He brought his mother, eager for a front-row seat to watch her son's plain wife sign away whatever little she had left. He brought Preston, phone already raised, ready to capture the finale for the group chat. The building was called Holstead Tower, 41 floors of glass rising over the financial district, home to the very bank whose card had been declined at Verano 6 weeks earlier. Julian didn't clock the irony. He was too busy laughing in the elevator with Simone, all the way up to the top floor, where the doors opened onto a boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city like something laid out for inspection. And the moment Adaline walked through those doors, something happened that no one in that group could explain. Every single person in the room stood. Board members. Senior executives. People in tailored suits who reported to no one, who hadn't stood for anyone in decades. Every last one of them rose to their feet the instant the quiet woman in the modest dress walked in. They stood the way people stand for someone they answer to. They stood the way an entire room stands for the person whose name, quietly, sits above all of theirs. Julian let out a nervous laugh, glancing around for the punchline. What is this? Adaline, what's going on?" Adaline walked to the head of the table without hurry and sat down in the largest chair in the room. The chairman of the bank, a silver-haired man with 40 years in the industry, stepped forward and addressed the room directly, his voice thick with something close to reverence. "For those who haven't had the privilege," he said, "this is the majority shareholder and controlling owner of Holstead Meridian. This bank, this tower, and every entity beneath it answers, ultimately, to her. I'd ask everyone to give her their full attention." The silence that followed did not land all at once. It came apart in pieces, and that was so much worse than a single collective gasp. Simone's hand slid off Julian's arm slowly, like her body understood before her mind caught up. Corinne's knees folded under her, and she found herself sitting in the nearest chair without anyone telling her to. And Preston, phone still raised out of pure habit, watched his own arm sink lower and lower as the reality settled in, that the humiliating video he'd posted to the family chat now lived on the personal phone of a woman whose company owned the very building they were standing in. The chairman wasn't finished. 11 years ago, he continued, a young woman walked into what was then a failing regional lender with an offer most of the men in this room laughed at. She had no family name behind her, no inherited capital, no connections to speak of. What she had was patience, discipline, and an eye for value nobody else in this industry was willing to sit with long enough to see. She bought what everyone else was too proud to touch. She held when the market panicked. She never once put her name in a headline. He looked at Adaline with something close to awe. I've spent 4 decades in finance. I have never once watched anyone build what this woman built, and she did it while the world called her a housewife. Julian was still standing, still searching the room for something that made sense. Owns, Adaline, what is he? You don't, you manage the household. You handle the little things. I keep the house, Adaline said gently, and there was no venom in it, only 12 years of exhaustion finally allowed to surface. Yes. And I keep a great deal more than that, Julian. I simply never needed you to applaud it. She looked at him then, not with hatred, which somehow undid him more completely than rage ever could have. Only a deep, tired, settled kind of clarity. You wanted the whole restaurant to watch me beg, she said. You planned it. You froze that account on purpose, hours before dinner, because you decided it would feel good to see me small in front of people. So I decided to let the whole room see something too. She slid a folder down the table toward him. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was the account he'd frozen to embarrass her, an account, it turned out, that had never truly belonged to him to freeze in the first place. It ran through Holstead Meridian. It always had. She had simply let him believe otherwise, the same generous, quiet way she had let him believe 100 other things over 12 years, because loving someone sometimes means letting them feel powerful even when the power was never really theirs. There was more. A second folder slid toward her from one of the executives, and she opened it without needing to look down, because she already knew exactly what it said. Your partnership, she said quietly. The one we were supposedly celebrating at Verano. Callister and Vane runs almost entirely on financing this bank provides. Your office. Your title. Your whole carefully built sense of who you are. It's been standing on a foundation I own, Julian. Every part of it. One of the younger board members, a woman who had clearly done her homework, leaned toward the chairman and murmured something about the timeline lining up with a name she recognized from an old prospectus. The chairman nodded once and let her finish the thought aloud, because he wanted the room to hear it in someone else's voice besides his own. Reyes Capital Holdings, the woman said, filed under a maiden name 11 years ago. I always wondered who was actually behind it. Half the analysts in this city have spent a decade trying to figure that out. She looked at Adaline with something between disbelief and admiration. You're the reason 3 separate distressed asset funds got outbid on this building's original acquisition. We used to talk about that deal in training seminars. Adaline said nothing to that. She didn't need to confirm it. The folder on the table already had. Simone was already backing toward the door. Adaline saw it. So did Julian. Her voice caught only once, just for a breath, as she said the truest thing that would be spoken in that room all day. That bill you refused to pay, she said. That card you froze on purpose, just to watch me humiliated in front of strangers. This bank earns more than the cost of that entire dinner in the time it took the waiter to walk back to our table. And I would have paid it 1,000 times over, gladly, if you had simply loved me. That's all I ever actually wanted from you, Julian. Not the title. Not the version of yourself you were performing that night. Just to be loved by the man I helped build. Julian opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He turned in a slow circle, searching every face in that boardroom for someone, anyone, still on his side. There was no one. Simone was nearly at the door. Corinne stared at her own folded hands. Preston still gripped a phone full of evidence of exactly what kind of people they had all decided to be. Adaline, Julian finally managed, his voice cracking. Please. We can fix this. I didn't mean. You did mean it, she said, quiet and certain. You planned it that afternoon. You wanted an audience for my humiliation, and you got one. She rose from the head of the table, unhurried, and closed her hand around the ledger inside her bag, the way she always did when she needed to remember exactly who had raised her. That's the difference between us, Julian. In 12 years, I never once tried to make you small. You couldn't get through a single dinner without trying to make me disappear in front of strangers. She picked up her bag. We're done, she said, and there was no cruelty in it, only a door closing quietly, for good. What happened next did not require raised voices. Balance, once it starts moving, tends to arrive quickly on its own. Within the month, the financing that had quietly propped up Julian's firm shifted, through decisions made in rooms he was never invited into. The partnership, the title, the corner office he'd built his entire identity around, all of it had been standing on ground that was never really his, and the moment Adaline simply stopped holding it steady, it began, slowly and then all at once, to come apart in his hands. Simone was gone before the story even finished making its way around the office. She had never loved Julian. She'd loved the trajectory she thought he was climbing. The instant that climb stopped, she stopped too, and moved on toward the next promising ladder without a backward glance. Women like that never say goodbye. They simply update their coordinates. Corinne's unraveling was slower and quieter, which somehow made it worse. When the extended family finally understood exactly who they'd spent months mocking in a group chat, the laughter didn't just stop, it reversed direction entirely. Cousins who had once giggled at Preston's video remembered, uncomfortably, who had actually shown up for them over the years with quiet generosity nobody had thought to acknowledge at the time. It had never been Corinne. Corinne called Adaline a dozen times in the weeks that followed, her voice suddenly warm, suddenly maternal, using the word daughter for the first time in 12 years now that she needed something from her. Adaline listened to exactly one voicemail. She never called back. Some doors, once they close, simply stay closed, no slamming required. Preston's fate was quieter but no less complete. The video he'd been so proud of, the one meant to immortalize Adaline's humiliation, became instead the piece of evidence everyone in the family eventually circled back to whenever his name came up. He tried, for a while, to reframe himself as someone who'd simply been caught up in the moment, but nobody was buying revisions anymore. The firm he worked for, as it turned out, also carried financing through Holstead Meridian, and while Adaline never lifted a finger to have him specifically targeted, boards have a way of quietly distancing themselves from anyone whose name keeps surfacing next to unflattering headlines. Preston wasn't fired. He simply stopped being invited to rooms that mattered, which, for a man like him, amounted to the same thing. Adaline never told the extended family what Corinne had done behind closed doors. Never spread a single word of the story herself. She didn't have to. The truth, once it's finally allowed to surface, tends to tell itself far more thoroughly than any retelling ever could. And through every bit of it, Adaline never once gloated. She gave no interviews. She released no statement. When the boardroom meeting ended, she simply gathered her things, checked that the ledger was still where it always was, and walked out into the ordinary afternoon light with her spine straight and her steps even, exactly as she had walked into that room. She could have taken everything from Julian, every last cent, the way he had promised, cheerfully, to take everything from her. She chose not to. She quietly arranged for him to keep enough to rebuild, not because he had earned that mercy, but because she had decided a long time ago, on a stool behind a hardware counter in a town too small for the map, exactly what kind of person she intended to remain no matter what was done to her. And that mercy, more than any punishment she could have engineered, was the thing that haunted Julian longest. Because every dollar he had left, he knew, had come from the open hand of the woman he'd thrown away. A season passed. The narrator wants to leave you somewhere gentler than a boardroom, because Adaline earned somewhere gentler. There's a porch now, small and unremarkable by design, white railings and creaking wooden steps, tucked into a quiet stretch of land far from glass towers and folded napkins and rooms full of people waiting to watch someone break. It looks, deliberately, like the porch behind her grandfather's hardware store. She built it that way on purpose. Some things you carry home with you, no matter how large your life eventually becomes. She could have built a palace. She had, by then, more than enough to build something so large it would have made every person who'd ever underestimated her choke on their own envy, and she could have done it without feeling a single thing. But that was never her dream. That was Julian's dream, and Corinne's, and Simone's, bigger, louder, glossier. Adaline's dream had always been smaller, and immeasurably richer. Morning light, a cup of coffee going cold beside her, people who loved her before they ever knew what she was worth. She sits on that porch most mornings now, and on the railing beside her, worn smooth from 3 generations of hands, sits a cracked leather ledger, honest, balanced, and still. The people who gather around her these days are the ones who loved her when she had nothing to offer them in return. Old friends who never once laughed at a video. A cousin who quietly checked on her during the worst weeks and never once asked what it would get her. Nobody on that porch measures Adaline by a balance sheet, because the people who do that were never really in her life to begin with, only in the audience of it. She is, for the first time in a long time, at peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from winning loudly. The quieter kind, the kind that comes back slowly, morning by morning, once you stop needing anyone's applause to know exactly who you are. And here's what she'd want you to carry out of this story with you. A quiet person is never the same thing as a weak one. The people who measure your worth by what's visible, your dress, your card, your silence in a room full of noise, will always miscount you, because what actually made you valuable was never sitting on the surface where they were looking. It was underneath the whole time, patient, honest, and building. Don't ever press your thumb down on someone to make yourself look bigger than you are. And don't let anyone else press theirs down on you, either, no matter how loudly the room laughs along with them. Balance has a way of finding its way home on its own timeline. You don't have to chase it. You only have to keep your hands honest, keep your heart intact, and wait. Adaline never chased it. In the end, it walked all the way back to her and sat down quietly on the porch beside her, in the gold morning light, and stayed. If this story reminded you that your worth was never anyone else's to decide, type ledger in the comments so she knows you heard her. Share this with the one person in your life who needs to remember their own quiet strength today. And subscribe, because next time, the person everyone underestimates might be the one who's been holding the whole thing together the entire time.